Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Catel and welcome to another episode of Basic Nigerian History. By now, we have covered multiple different groups of people in the area that would eventually become Nigeria. But there's many more peoples left to cover. Unfortunately, I will not be covering each and every single one, hence why this series is called Basic Nigerian History and not Nigerian History series. I would like to move on to the next stage of history, but before I do, let's use this episode to do a quick summary of the different people in the area. In the area that would eventually become Nigeria, trade was the most important factor linking all different societies and peoples together. No one society could be solely independent and it had to rely on the others around it for things it didn't have. This meant good interstate relationship was important, so trade routes were the joint responsibility of the different states. Intermarriages was another common practice among the societies, which helped spread people from different backgrounds around. Cultural activities like festivals, foods, words from different languages circulated all over the community lines and across states and incorporated themselves into the various states. As we know, connections of states can be found in their origin stories. Even though many myths such as the Hausa talk about the founder being from an outside or a migrant or an outsider, many others say that the founder was from within, and the founder always met an already established society in place. Example are the Nupe, who trace their origin to an Igala prince, and the Igala have traditions that link them with the Yoruba. The Idoma claim descent from Junkun, who in turn claim a shared origin with Kanem. The Efik claim origin from intermarriage between the Igbo and the Ibibio, and the Yoruba claim that they were founded by an Oba from Benin. And of course, the Yoruba and Benin claim a link to Oramiyan and Ododua. As well as trade and marriage, migration also occurred due to war or even the slave trade. Speaking of the slave trade, this is a good time to talk about slavery in Africa before the Europeans arrived. Now, slavery in Africa was different to what is now known when we think of slavery. It wasn't chattel slavery, but it was more integrative. Slaves in the area that would become Nigeria tended to be assimilated into their new societies and perform tasks similar to those performed by free men and women. Don't forget, all Askars were sons of concubines, which basically meant that they were female slaves. Furthermore, among the Mosi and the Wolof people, army generals were chosen systematically from slaves. Slaves were traded on the trans-saharan trade routes for centuries before the Europeans came, and were considered perfect for the trade routes because the further a slave traveled, the more valuable he or she was. They didn't spoil, they were self-transporting, and they could also help carry stuff if needed during the long journey. For example, if an animal died or was lost. Now, the exact number of slaves traded on the trans-saharan trade routes is unknown, but from 650 to 1600, it was estimated to be about 4.8 million. Now, the real number could be half of this or significantly higher, because the range was between 3,000 and 8,000 slaves traded per year. Up north, the Hausa states and the Kanem Kingdom regularly had conflicts with their neighbors, and as they fought for dominance over the trade routes, capturing slaves in these raids and wars became a tactic and a goal. They then sold these captives for profits. Now, we all know that slavery in itself is wrong, and no one would defend such a practice in this day and age. However, it would be unfair if I didn't mention that the slaves traded on the trans-Saharan trade routes weren't treated like chattel, as Islam had many rules governing the taking, treating, and freeing of slaves. For example, only non-Muslims could be taken as slaves, so a lot of the societies that had accepted Islam, like the Hausa Kingdom or the Kanem Borno Empire, mainly got their slaves from down south, although sometimes they still took each other as slaves in the raids. In the northern region, young female slaves were the most abundantly traded on the trans-Saharan trade routes as a harem for wealthy Muslim men, and over time they integrated themselves into the society through marriage or childbirth. Women couldn't be sold once they gave birth to their first child, and if a slave woman did give birth, that child would be free at birth. Furthermore, if a free man wanted to have children with a slave woman, he had to marry her first, which would mean freeing her, although a lot of people chose to ignore this rule and just had children with slave women without marrying them. The freeing of slaves was common penance for sins, and because the giving of alms was regularly mandatory in Islam, freeing of slaves was commonly used as an act of generosity. For the Hausa Kingdom's constant warfare against each other, slaves were incredibly important. They acted as soldiers, guards, labor, and in some cases, like in Kanem-Borno, they were sold on the trans-Saharan trade routes for guns and horses. Kingdoms that won got more slaves, which in turn meant more economic progress. Further down south, in the southwest, where the Oyo Empire resides, slaves were often extremely important aspects of the society, providing the bureaucratic and military backbone, like the Ilari eunuchs that acted as spies and tax collectors for the empires. A lot of slaves were trained as soldiers and rose to prominent position. They weren't a separate class and they tended to be dependents of the owning family and to do the same type of work that other family members did. 3 eunuchs were the most senior titled slaves and were the second highest authority after the Alaafin in 3 matters. The Ona Irefa, which is the eunuch in the middle, was the highest in judicial matters. He handed down legal rulings in place of the Alaafin. The Otun Irefa, which is the eunuch of the right, was the highest in religious matters and in charge of the court of Shango. The Osi Irefa, which is the eunuch of the left, was the highest in administrative matters and collected revenues, served as the Alaafin's proxy in dealing with the courts. Not to mention, all of the Ilari was under his command and reported to him as well as the Alaafin on matters of the provinces they were in. Now, the duties of slaves being so important and distributed meant that the empire could remain stable through periods of instability or during a reign of a rubbish Alaafin. Also, because these people were slaves and had no lineage, it meant that they couldn't acquire any power on their own and they could be trusted completely with no fear of ambitious scheming. In the southeast area, slaves were an important force in the political economy. They were farmers, laborers, and even slave raiders and traders in their own right. Some even became exceedingly wealthy and powerful leaders in their communities. In other areas further down south, slaves that had been stripped of kingship ties could be sold for money, traded for goods, given as gifts or tributes, or used as a sacrificial offering in traditional religious settings. The ability to integrate into kinship networks and be regularly freed in slave systems meant that slaves were generally not a self-reproducing pool. It wasn't something that carried on past one generation, and as a result, the markets for buying and selling of slaves always existed. Now, let's do a conclusion of what we've learned. We've learned that although there was a large diverse mix of people in Nigeria, the people had a close working relationship with each other and intermingled and intermarried. We also learned that slavery had been going on in Africa long before the Europeans arrived. However, it was a different form of slavery, one in which the slaves weren't treated like chattel, and they did the same work as ordinary free men and free women. Although there were many ways in which a slave could rise up in society and become free again, it never carried on past a generation, which meant that children couldn't be born into slavery. Now that's it for this episode. Next episode, we're going to be talking about slavery when the Europeans arrived and how we went from this kind of slavery to less than human being slavery.